One afternoon around the year 2000, a journalist walked into a lively cafe located just a few blocks away from the courthouse in downtown Los Angeles. His mission was clear: to gather information about a man believed to have been deeply involved in one of the most horrifying crimes of the 20th century. This crime had occurred 35 years earlier, when the infamous cult leader, Charles Manson, instructed his devoted followers to carry out a gruesome attack at a luxurious Beverly Hills residence. The house belonged to a pregnant actress and her husband, a well-known film director. By the time the night was over, 5 people had been savagely murdered in cold blood, dabbed dozens of times for reasons that defied logic. Shockingly, the killing spree did not end there. The following night, Manson's followers struck again, this time taking the lives of a married couple in a nearby neighborhood. Although Manson and his followers were all ultimately sentenced to life in prison, the journalist couldn't shake the suspicion that Manson may have been nothing more than a puppet part of a much more elaborate and sinister conspiracy, possibly orchestrated by powerful forces within the U.S. government. And now, sitting quietly at one of the cafe's tables, was the man who might hold the answers. A lawyer, dressed in a dark suit. He had agreed to speak about someone named Reeve Whitson, name the journalist had heard repeatedly in connection to the Manson murders. This lawyer, it turned out, had been one of Whitson's few trusted friends. After the obligatory pleasantries and a few sips of coffee, the lawyer leaned in, lowered his voice, and revealed a startling secret. Whitson, he claimed, was a CIA operative. The journalist was stunned, but the lawyer continued. In the late 1960s, according to him, Whitson had been working on a classified CIA operation. His assignment involved infiltrating elite social circles, befriending celebrities and influential people across Hollywood. One of those individuals, it turned out, was among the victims murdered during that first night of Manson's rampage. What made the story even more chilling was the next detail. The lawyer insisted that Whitson had called several people on the morning following the murders, beginning as early as 7 a.m., to tell them what had happened. That was highly suspicious, since police didn't officially discover the bodies until around 8:30 a.m., when the maid arrived and walked into the aftermath. The journalist immediately asked the obvious question: how had Whitson known about the murders before the authorities did? The lawyer hesitated, glanced nervously around the cafe, and finally answered. Whitson, he said, had been present at the crime scene. The journalist's mind was sent into a tailspin. A CIA operative, somehow at the scene of one of the most grotesque mass murders in Hollywood history, standing among the mutilated bodies of 5 victims and, then, inexplicably, choosing not to report it. The background noise of the bustling cafe seemed to fade into silence as the journalist sat in shock. If this account were true, it would mean that the CIA might have had a direct hand in one of the most notorious crimes of the modern era. In the early 1970s, Charles Manson gripped the American public with a disturbing blend of fascination and revulsion. On one level, he was a ragged, barely literate ex-convict whose criminal record began when he tried to burn down his elementary school at age 9. But there was something else, a haunting charisma in his wild eyes and prophetic ravings about apocalyptic doom. That twisted charm helped him assemble a group of loyal followers, a makeshift cult he dubbed the Manson family. In 1969, Manson commanded his followers to carry out a brutal wave of killings he believed would ignite a race war. The violence began at the home of famed film director Roman Polanski and his wife, Sharon Tate, who was over 8 months pregnant. Polanski was away, but Tate and 4 others inside the house were held captive and then slaughtered. Tate was stabbed 16 times while pleading for the life of her unborn child, to make the attack appear politically motivated. One of the killers smeared the word pig in Tate's blood on the front door. The following evening, they struck again, this time murdering a husband and wife in another part of Los Angeles. They left a carving fork embedded in one of the bodies, looted the fridge, scrawled bizarre messages across the walls, and blood phrases like "death to pigs" and Helter Skelter, a reference to a Beatles song. By the time Manson landed in prison in 1971, he had been convicted of multiple murders, but boasted of being responsible for at least 35. Still, the truth behind Charles Manson remained murky. Was he truly the mastermind, or had he been manipulated by darker, hidden forces? That very question began to consume journalist Tom O'Neill, who would dedicate years of his life trying to uncover what really happened and why. This two-part series follows O'Neill's descent into a story that offered few answers and only deeper mysteries. The more he searched, the stranger things became. It all began on the morning of March 21st, 1999. The phone rang in O'Neill's small Venice Beach apartment. He was groggy, recovering from a wild party, celebrating his 40th birthday the night before. "Still half asleep," he answered. On the line was an editor he knew from Premiere Magazine, a major film publication. She had a proposition. Would he write a feature article for their August issue, marking the 30th anniversary of the Manson killings? A tainted, straightforward interview of few entertainment. Figures who had been affected by the murders and reflect on the impact the case had left on Hollywood. O'Neill hesitated. What more was there to say about Charles Manson? It was 1999. The case had already been dissected in countless books, documentaries, and low-budget films. The prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, had published the definitive account, Helter Skelter, in 1975. It became the best-selling true crime book in history. According to Bugliosi, Helter Skelter referred to Manson's delusional race war fantasy. He had hoped to pin the murders on the Black Panthers and provoke chaos, eventually emerging from the ruins as a messianic leader. It was a tired narrative, and O'Neill had his doubts. Still, he needed the paycheck. His career had taken a dip, and turning 40 had brought on an existential crisis. So he accepted. He pulled out his Rolodex and began contacting Hollywood elites who had once moved in Sharon Tate's social circles. Ko Shin, Warren Beatty, Jane Fonda, Dennis Hopper. None of them would talk. He moved down the list: Mia Farrow, Angelica Houston, Paul Newman, Kirk Douglas. Rejection after rejection. These were crimes from a generation ago, and all of the killers were behind bars. Why was everyone still so hesitant to speak? O'Neill sensed that this silence wasn't ordinary. Neil hinted at something being buried. Determined, he reached out to others involved in the case. He was surprised when Bugliosi himself agreed to speak. But the conversation went nowhere. Bugliosi only recited passages from his own book, offering no new insight, as if reading from a prepared script. O'Neill realized he needed to go beyond the official version. He had to look where no one else had dared. Soon after, he sat down for sushi with another reporter who had covered the Manson trial. Their conversation drifted into a strange territory. What if the motives behind the murders were entirely different than what had been claimed? The reporter offered a warning. Be careful. A story like this can take over your life. But O'Neill already knew it had. Digging deeper into the early police records, one name kept resurfacing: Preston Guillory, a former detective with the LA County Sheriff's Department. Its jurisdiction had included Spahn Ranch, the dilapidated movie set where Manson and his family had taken up residence. Guillory had a reputation for making wild claims, but he stood by them as the truth. A few weeks later, on a hazy afternoon in 1999, O'Neill found himself pulling into a dull strip mall 50 miles southeast of Los Angeles, wedged between a taco joint and the check-cashing office turned out to be a modest private detective agency. O'Neill crossed the parking lot and stepped inside, where he was greeted by an older, stocky man with white hair and a thick mustache. He introduced himself as Preston Giller. With a nod toward the chair in front of his desk, Giller invited O'Neill to sit, and he did. O'Neill opened the conversation by mentioning a transcript he had read, a controversial radio interview Giller had given back in 1971, 2 years after the notorious murders. In that broadcast, Giller had laid out disturbing details of Manson's behavior in the lead-up to the Tate murders. Kay claimed law enforcement had knowingly allowed Manson to slip through their fingers, despite serious violations. Giller alleged that Manson had unrestricted access to alcohol, narcotics, and even underage girls, all under the full awareness of his parole officer and officers stationed at the Malibu Patrol Office. They even knew about automatic weapons being fired at Spahn Ranch. "We received complaints from citizens," Giller recalled. "We were told not to make arrests. That was the policy. No arrests, no interference with Manson or his people, to any officer using common sense." This didn't sit right. Giller's revelations during that radio appearance had painted a perplexing portrait. O'Neill asked the obvious question: why wasn't Manson, a known parole violator, returned to prison? Giller admitted he didn't know for sure, but he believed a significant clue came about a week after the Tate murders, while the investigation was still underway. On August 16, 1969, the LA County Sheriff's Department launched the largest raid in its history at Spahn Ranch. Over 100 officers stormed the place, AR-15s in hand, helicopters circling above. 30 individuals were taken into custody. The strangest part, the raid had absolutely nothing to do with the murders. Giller's superiors claimed they were targeting a car theft operation, that Manson was leading a ring of stolen vehicles. Giller thought that explanation was absurd. At the time, authorities were swamped with a high-profile murder case dominating national headlines. Yet, they chose to send in a massive task force, not for murder suspects, but for a bunch of hippies stealing cars. And what followed only deepened the mystery. Authorities confiscated drugs, some machine guns, piles of stolen wallets, and credit cards. But within 72 hours, every member of the Manson family walked free. No charges were filed. To O'Neill, this was utterly baffling. Why stage a massive operation if no one was going to be held accountable? Why was Manson seemingly untouchable, stood to gain by letting him walk? Giller frowned. O'Neill could see the conversation was digging up long-held resentment in the retired detective. But Giller said his anger reached a boiling point in December 1969, 3 months after the Tate murders, when the LAPD held a press conference declaring the case had been solved. Manson and his evil hippie cult were named as the culprits. The search was over. And in the eyes of the public, Manson was the perfect villain. But to Giller, the story didn't add up. Law enforcement had long known that Manson was dangerous. Why had they allowed him to roam free? Why hadn't they acted before the killings? Giller decided to go public. He went to a local news station and told them everything he'd seen. He placed the blame squarely on senior officials who had failed to rein in Manson. Not long after that interview aired, Giller was fired. Now O'Neill understood why. Even decades later, Giller remained furious. Something wasn't right. Later that day, stuck in traffic on his way home, O'Neill's thoughts churned. The Manson case wasn't just disturbing, it was tangled and far more complex than he had imagined. Why had the sheriff's department allowed Manson so much freedom for so long? Is it only after the horrific murders that someone in authority finally drew the line? Motivated by his meeting with Giller, O'Neill decided to consult a retired deputy district attorney. He wanted clarity. How had Manson repeatedly broken parole without facing consequences? The former prosecutor didn't mince words. It wasn't an accident. That blunt statement stunned O'Neill. Could a local sheriff alone have protected Manson? It didn't seem possible. Some greater power had to be involved. By August 1999, the deadline for O'Neill's 30th anniversary article on the murders had come and gone, but his story was nowhere near finished. He explained to his editor that the article had evolved into something deeper, more explosive. Though the missed deadline wasn't ideal, his editor encouraged him to continue digging. A few months later, on a freezing December afternoon, O'Neill was driving along an icy road in Michigan. His investigation now strongly suggested that law enforcement had deliberately shielded Manson in the months before the murders. Part of him was overwhelmed. He had stumbled into something vast and possibly dangerous, but another part of him was electrified. This was what journalism was meant to be, the pursuit of truth, no matter the cost. That drive brought him to Ann Arbor, Michigan, for a meeting with another critical figure from Manson's past, his former parole officer. Back in 1967. Charles Manson had been released from federal prison after serving 7 years for violating probation on a check fraud charge. He moved to Berkeley, California, where he came under the supervision of parole officer Roger Smith. For nearly a year, they met regularly. Roger Smith witnessed Manson's evolution firsthand, from petty conman to charismatic cult leader. The Bay Area, particularly in 1967, was ground zero for the counterculture movement, the Summer of Love. Manson found his element there, and his following of hippie runaways, the infamous Manson family, steadily grew. O'Neill was eager to understand what Roger had seen in those early days. From what he'd uncovered, Roger may have been far more involved in Manson's life than his job required. After leaving parole work, Roger joined the staff at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, a place where countless hippies sought medical help. There, Roger led a research project that examined links between heavy methamphetamine use and violent behavior. Incredibly, Roger sometimes continued parole meetings with Manson at the clinic. He even convinced Manson to relocate to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, right near the clinic. O'Neill began to wonder whether Manson had somehow become part of that drug and violence research. When O'Neill finally called Roger Smith for an interview, he was surprised at how quickly Roger agreed. He explained that for years he had avoided speaking publicly about Manson out of concern for his professional reputation. But now, as retirement approached, those concerns no longer mattered. O'Neill drove up a quiet dirt road to a farmhouse nestled in the snowy countryside. Roger greeted him warmly and invited him into a cozy living room where his wife, Carmen, sat by a crackling fireplace. Homemade pizza filled the air with comforting aroma, and bottles of wine were already open. O'Neill felt awkward. Roger and Carmen had clearly prepared for a pleasant evening. But he had come loaded with unsettling questions. Once they were settled, O'Neill presented Roger with old parole documents, each one bearing his signature. These memos reported that Manson was complying with the terms of parole and was not engaged in any suspicious behavior. Roger peered at the documents, squinting as he reviewed them. Then he set them down and took a long sip of wine. He said he couldn't remember the details. None of it seemed familiar. When O'Neill asked why his memory was so hazy, Roger simply shrugged. He said he'd been a young, naive guy in his 20s. Being a parole officer was just a job to fund grad school. O'Neill showed him another report from late 1967. In it, Roger had written that Manson was making excellent progress. O'Neill asked what progress he had been referring to. Roger didn't offer much explanation. He said the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood was overrun with drugged-out hippies, and, compared to most, Manson had seemed relatively stable. But O'Neill pressed further. What about Manson's drug use? Numerous former followers had testified that Manson took LSD every day and insisted his entire family join him. Yet not one of Roger's reports mentioned that. Again, Roger shrugged. Then he popped open another bottle of wine. To be honest, he said, taking LSD in San Francisco in 1967 was like having a beer. It was just normal. O'Neill had always viewed it as something illicit. He waited patiently while Roger refilled his glass. Then he pivoted the conversation, his curiosity now fixed on Smith's work at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. O'Neill pointed out how risky it seemed to observe amphetamine users in the same location where parolees held their meetings, unless, of course, Charles Manson had been involved in one of Roger's drug studies. He asked him directly. That broke Rogers.com. His voice rose sharply as he accused O'Neill of chasing imaginary connections. He insisted Manson was never part of any such study. Just like that, Roger shut down the conversation. O'Neill could read the signs. He left. That night, driving through the snow back to his hotel, O'Neill couldn't shake the thought. Was Roger hiding something deeper about his connection to Manson? The journalist didn't have the answer, but he knew he had to keep digging. For months, O'Neill had been attempting to reach the central figure in this twisted puzzle, Charles Manson himself, and finally, in early 2000, a breakthrough. One of Manson's former associates helped him secure a rare 5-minute phone interview with a cult leader, who was then incarcerated in a California state prison. The morning of the call, February 14th, Valentine's Day, O'Neill was jittery with nerves. He was about to speak with a mass murderer whose eerie charisma had compelled others to kill without hesitation. The call connected with a crackle. Manson's voice emerged, muttering, rambling nonsense. O'Neill introduced himself, but that marked the end of any meaningful dialogue. Manson spoke in cryptic riddles and incoherent phrases. The 5 minutes slipped away as O'Neill sat frozen, realizing he would never get the truth directly from the source. Months later, in the summer of 2000, O'Neill drove across the Bay Bridge into San Francisco on a bright, beautiful afternoon. He was nearly broke, but felt reinvigorated. The deeper he dug, the more certain he became that the mainstream story about the Manson murders was riddled with holes. One glaring issue centered around Vincent Bugliosi, the lead prosecutor in the case and author of a best-selling book that had shaped public perception. O'Neill uncovered troubling inconsistencies between Bugliosi's narrative and the official police files. Shockingly, he even found a handwritten note from Bugliosi, admitting a key prosecution witness had lied under oath. Yet no one had ever challenged him on it. O'Neill knew it wasn't yet time to confront Bugliosi. He needed to assemble his own case, and his instincts kept circling back to the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic in San Francisco. Everything seemed to point there in O'Neill's mind. A chilling theory was forming. Someone in a position of power had used Manson as part of a covert experiment, and the clinic was the epicenter. To get closer to the truth, he decided to go see the place for himself. Walking the steep streets of San Francisco, O'Neill eventually turned a corner and arrived at the clinic. The building, once vividly painted with swirling psychedelic murals when it opened in 1967, was now stark and plain. Inside, the walls were stripped bare, except for a few framed articles celebrating its past. After a brief look around, O'Neill left. The place felt scrubbed clean of secrets, as if its history had been deliberately erased. Back in his hotel room, he pulled out a 1971 memoir titled Love Needs Care, written by Dr. David Smith, or Dr. Dave, the clinic's founder. Though the book was mostly self-congratulatory, O'Neill found several revealing passages, especially those about the clinic's funding. One of its biggest backers had been the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH. That name triggered a memory. O'Neill opened his laptop, searched through his files, found the connection. In 1976, the NIM had admitted to being used as a cover for CIA operations. The CIA, the same agency that had employed Reeves Whitson, a known associate of Manson who somehow had foreknowledge of the Tate murders before law enforcement did. O'Neill's mind began racing. Had the CIA secretly funded the clinic while Manson was a patient there? Dr. Dave's memoir also revealed that the clinic's government-backed research heavily focused on hallucinogens like LSD and stimulants such as amphetamines. It was also clear that Roger Smith, Manson's former parole officer, was leading something called the Amphetamine Research Project during that time. But O'Neill would never be able to confirm Manson's involvement through official documentation, because in 1969, someone had broken into the Haight-Ashbury Clinic and stolen every file related to that research. Nothing else had been taken. The timing was suspicious. It happened right after Manson's arrest. Even more telling, members of the Manson family had admitted to police that they had taken amphetamines prior to carrying out the brutal murders. To O'Neill, this was no coincidence. It deepened his conviction that Manson and his followers had been unknowingly used as test subjects in a larger, more sinister project. But what was the purpose? He still did not have the answer. 3 weeks later, on a gray weekday morning, O'Neill sat at his desk, sipping coffee, flipping through a folder brimming with research on David Smith, the enigmatic doctor who founded the Haight-Ashbury Clinic. One of O'Neill's sources claimed that Dr. Dave had definitely used his hippie patients, including Manson, as subjects in his drug studies. He even considered Manson so important that he sent an assistant to keep documenting him after he relocated from San Francisco to Los Angeles. But that was only part of the puzzle. In reading Dr. Dave's research articles, O'Neill came across something chilling, a psychological condition Smith had observed during group LSD use. When people tripped together repeatedly, they began to share a warped, collective version of reality. Smith named it the psychedelic syndrome. Susan Atkins, one of Manson's most loyal followers and a key participant in the Tate murders, Tate acknowledged this mind-twisting effect. In a 1976 prison interview, she revealed she had taken LSD over 300 times. She spoke about how acid blurred reality and how easy it was to become confused under its influence. She even suggested it deserved its own thesis, a full study on how LSD could damage the human mind. Dr. Dave had already written extensively on the subject. Eventually, O'Neill managed to get Dr. Dave to agree to an interview. In the voicemail he left, said Mel had been vague about the exact purpose. He didn't want the doctor to come prepared with rehearsed answers. He had too much to answer for. O'Neill's heart pounded as he dialed the number. This could either unlock the truth or end in another dead end. On the 5th ring, Dr. Dave picked up. O'Neill began with polite compliments, mentioning his recent visit to the clinic and praising Dr. Dave's memoir. The doctor expressed pride in the clinic's history, but didn't say much more. Then O'Neill shifted to the real issue. He brought up the psychedelic syndrome, noting how it sounded eerily close to brainwashing. He took a breath, then asked the burning question. Had Manson learned to manipulate people using such a technique during his time at the clinic? Without hesitation, Dr. Dave denied any such connection. Manson had never been involved in any of his research studies, he claimed. He was merely continuing research he'd begun long before founding the clinic. O'Neill pushed further, asking about a study involving rats that had been injected with LSD and amphetamines, confined in tight spaces. Was it true that most of them ended up killing each other in violent rage? Dr. Dave grunted. Yes, he admitted. Often the rats turned aggressive. O'Neill couldn't ignore the chilling parallel. Dr. Dave was studying how LSD and stimulants could reshape behavior, while simultaneously Charles Manson had been using those same substances on his followers. The pattern was impossible to overlook. Dr. Dave refused to take the bait. When asked about using the same drugs to manipulate his followers in the same city, he downplayed everything. He insisted Charles Manson had very little connection to the Haight-Ashbury Clinic, claiming he showed up only now and then for parole check-ins or to collect medications for his followers. But O'Neill didn't buy it. He sat quietly, suspicious. A different source had told him that Dr. Dave had once been so intrigued by Manson and his group that, just months before the murders, he had written an academic paper on them. However, after the Manson family was tied to the brutal killings of Sharon Tate and others, Dr. Dave had allegedly pulled the article just before it was due to be published. When O'Neill brought this up, the doctor shrugged it off, saying the paper had been the idea of one of his assistants, not his own. He claimed he was merely a supervisor on the project. Still, O'Neill pressed him further. What about the theft of the amphetamine research project files? Those files had gone missing immediately after the Manson family was identified as suspects in the murders. Could that have been to protect one of the clinic's biggest sponsors? A sponsor believed to be a front for the CIA? A long silence followed. O'Neill imagined Dr. Dave's mind racing to come up with a plausible excuse. Once again, the doctor didn't budge. He denied any burglary ever took place and insisted he had no idea where the files had gone. Then, abruptly, he shut the interview down. Dr. Dave told O'Neill to leave him out of whatever story he was working on. A click followed, then the dull hum of a dial tone. But O'Neill wasn't discouraged. In fact, he was energized. The doctor's heated response had struck a nerve. It was clear he was trying to downplay his connection to Manson. As O'Neill stepped outside to clear his thoughts, a new suspicion began to crystallize. Dr. Dave might have been conducting drug research for the CIA, and Manson, along with his followers, could have been involved. Could this research have focused on how to use drugs to control the human mind? If so, that could help a spy agency train agents and assassins to act without hesitation. And perhaps Manson had learned to use those same techniques to program his cult to kill. On a breezy June morning in 2001, O'Neill paced inside his home office. An entire wall was covered in thumbtacked photos, scribbled dates, and hand-drawn lines connecting police, criminals, celebrities, and events. Manson had consumed his life. It had been nearly 2 years since O'Neill first began digging into Charles Manson and his possible ties to the CIA. He had missed so many deadlines that he no longer owed Premier magazine an article, and that brought a sense of relief. He had come to understand this was no longer a magazine story. It had evolved into something far bigger, a full-blown investigation, possibly even a book. O'Neill also knew this would make him enemies. People like Manson's former parole officer, Roger Smith, and Dr. Dave, not to mention former prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, the man behind Helter Skelter. Bugliosi's entire case, and the best-selling book that followed, was based on the idea that Manson was driven by a fantasy to trigger a race war and reshape society. It was the cornerstone of his legacy, and O'Neill was working to dismantle it. But none of that mattered. O'Neill believed the truth needed to be told, even if it meant challenging the official narrative. That very morning, he was chasing one of the most promising leads he'd found yet, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. He was convinced it was the smoking gun that explained Manson's evolution from a small-time criminal to a murderous cult leader. As O'Neill investigated how Manson managed to exert such powerful control over his followers, he discovered another key figure, Dr. Louise Jolion Jolly West. West had worked at the clinic alongside Roger and David Smith during the same period when Manson had been a semi-regular visitor. Starting in 1967, there wasn't much information on West until O'Neill stumbled upon his obituary, revealed that West had died in 1999 and left behind 265 boxes of his archives to UCLA. He had served as chair of the psychiatry department until 1989. O'Neill headed straight to the UCLA library. A clerk at the front desk directed him to the basement where the archives were stored. He passed dusty metal racks until he reached the counter. A library assistant heaved a huge cardboard box in front of him. This was box number 1, with 264 more to go. O'Neill sat down and began sorting through folder after folder of yellowed, aging papers. His mind struggled to process the sheer weight of information, much of it highly technical. He found dozens of press clippings about the Manson murders and even research papers authored by Roger and David Smith. For the rest of the summer, O'Neill kept returning to the archive, digging deeper and deeper. Then he found something that stopped him cold, a series of letters exchanged between Dr. West and a figure well known in CIA history, Sidney Gottlieb, the infamous biochemist who had overseen Project MKUltra. MKUltra was a covert CIA program launched in the 1950s and 60s. It aimed to develop mind control techniques using drugs, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation, often without the subject's knowledge or consent. In one of the letters, West laid out how such experiments could be carried out secretly, and in another especially disturbing message, he claimed to have discovered a way to erase a person's real memories and replace them with new, permanent, false ones. O'Neill was transfixed. Then, buried at the bottom of yet another box, he found a plain manila folder. The top page was stamped classified in bold red letters as he skimmed its contents. O'Neill realized this file was never supposed to be saved, and certainly never meant to be seen by a civilian. It was a letter from Gottlieb to West, discussing the doctor's involvement with yet another infamous figure. Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who had gunned down Lee Harvey Oswald, lived on national TV in 1963, days after Oswald had assassinated President John F. Kennedy. A chill ran down O'Neill's spine. What if West, through his work with M. Cotra, had helped manipulate not just Charles Manson, but Jack Ruby as well? What if the horrifying acts of violence committed by both men were actually the result of the same twisted psychological experiments, orchestrated by the CIA and Dr. West? O'Neill ran upstairs to the library's computer lab. Hands trembling, he logged in and began typing an email to his agent explaining everything he had just uncovered. After he hit send, he sat in silence. He knew his agent might think he had gone too far, that he had lost himself in some fringe conspiracy theory. And maybe, just maybe, his agent would be right. But deep inside, O'Neill's gut told him otherwise. He still had countless unanswered questions. He couldn't yet see the end of the tunnel, but he knew he was headed somewhere. And that's where we'll go next, in part 2 of Manson and the CIA.